Greetings, friends of the wild. I'm Wilder. I'm 55 years old, and long ago, I chose to leave the noise of the city streets behind to tie my life to the untamed wilderness. Having spent nearly half a century breathing the same air as the beasts of the forest, I have always believed that animals are not just mindless creatures, but kindred spirits with deeply empathetic souls. Today, gathered around this flickering campfire, I want to share with you a true story that once changed the entire world. It is the extraordinary memoir of an 18-year bond between Ralph Helfer, a legendary Hollywood animal trainer, and Zamba, an orphaned African lion. In an era when the industry relied on bullwhips, guns, and fear to force wild animals into submission, Ralph defied it all. He pioneered affection training, choosing instead to communicate through respect, patience, and warm embraces. In return, Zamba, a majestic 500-pound king of the jungle, became the gentlest of movie stars. More than that, he became a soulmate who stood by Ralph's side, trusting him so absolutely that they faced the boundary between life and death together during a catastrophic flood. This story is the fiercest testament to one simple truth. Even the most dangerous predators on the planet know how to love, as long as we are willing to offer them love first. Before we step into this miraculous journey with Zamba, I want you to tell me, where in the world are you listening to this story from today? Are you surrounded by the bright lights of a bustling city, or tucked away in a quiet, peaceful corner of the countryside? Let me know in the comments below, and if your heart beats in rhythm with the wild, hit that subscribe button so we can keep gathering around the fire for more incredible stories to come. Close your eyes for a moment. Just listen. Feel the wind here in Soledad Canyon, California. It is a crisp, cool evening. The air is thick with the scent of dry sage and cooling earth. The sun is just starting to dip below the ridgeline, painting the clouds in bruised shades of violet and burning orange, casting long, quiet shadows through the oak trees. Standing here, in this peaceful, forgiving place, where the weather wraps around you like an old, familiar coat, my mind is pulled across the world. It is pulled to a place where the sky is not so gentle, where the weather does not embrace you, but tests you. Africa. A place where the midday sun beats down on the dry, golden savannah like a hammer on an anvil, where the air is so thick with heat it shimmers, distorting the horizon, where the line between life and death is sometimes as thin as a single breath. In the heart of that blinding, unforgiving heat, a sound tore through the silence. A gunshot, sharp, unnatural, and devastating. It echoed across the plains, scattering the birds and shattering the ancient peace of the wild. The man holding the rifle was a poacher. Imagine a man gaunt and hollowed out, his skin baked to the texture of cracked leather by years under the relentless sun. His eyes were hard, flat, and devoid of any empathy, the eyes of a man who looked at the magnificent breathing tapestry of nature and saw only currency. He did not see the majesty of the animal in his sights. He did not see a mother. He simply pulled the trigger. When the acrid smoke cleared, a massive lioness lay motionless in the yellow grass, the proud life of a savannah queen, extinguished in an instant for a handful of dirty money. And there, hiding in the tall grass, pressed flat against the cooling earth, was a tiny cub. He was incredibly small, barely the size of a stray dog, his golden coat still carrying the faint, dark spots of infancy. His eyes, round and wide, were pools of absolute terror. He was shaking uncontrollably. He did not understand the concept of a bullet. He only knew that the warm, steady heartbeat of his mother, the center of his entire universe, had suddenly stopped. He nudged her lifeless body with his small, wet nose. He let out a series of high-pitched, desperate mewls, begging her to wake up. But she did not move. He was entirely alone. An orphan in a landscape that shows no mercy to the weak, but destiny, even in its darkest moments, sometimes orchestrates a miracle. That miracle arrived in the form of a man named Ralph Helfer. Ralph was not your typical Hollywood figure. He was a man in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet, deliberate grace of someone who had spent his life reading the silent language of animals. His hands were large and calloused, crisscrossed with a map of pale, thin scars, the inevitable physical cost of working closely with predators. But it was his face that truly defined him. He had a warm, deeply weathered face, framed by unkempt sandy hair, and eyes that held a profound, bottomless well of compassion. Ralph had seen the ugly side of animal training in America. He had seen the whips, the chairs, the heavy chains, and the fear. He despised it. He believed in something entirely different. He believed in love. When Ralph found the orphaned cub, he did not approach him with a snare or a heavy net. He dropped to his knees in the dust. He lowered his broad shoulders to make himself look smaller, less threatening. The cub backed away, flattening his ears, baring his tiny, needle-like teeth, and letting out a sharp, defensive hiss. It was pure instinct, but Ralph was patient. He spoke in a low, rumbling voice, a soothing hum that vibrated in the hot air. Slowly, deliberately, Ralph reached out with his scarred hands. He scooped the trembling creature up from the dirt and pulled him tightly against his chest. For a second, the cub fought. But then, feeling the solid, rhythmic thumping of Ralph's heart, the little lion stopped struggling. He buried his face into the fabric of Ralph's shirt. Ralph looked down at the golden ball of fur and gave him a name. Zamba. The journey that followed was a chaotic blur for the young lion. He was taken from the burning, blood-scented plains of Africa and thrust into a terrifying world of metal cages, deafening airplane engines, and shifting altitudes. They crossed oceans and continents, leaving the only world Zamba had ever known far behind. Finally, the noise stopped. They arrived in the United States at a place called Africa, USA, Ralph's sprawling animal sanctuary nestled in the rolling hills of California. The contrast was immediate and jarring for the cub. Gone was the searing heat and the endless flat horizon. Here, the air was cool and carried the scent of eucalyptus, fresh water, and hundreds of other unfamiliar animals. It was here that Zamba met Tony, Ralph's wife. Tony was a striking woman, slender and graceful, with sun-kissed hair that caught the light when she walked. She had a smile that radiated absolute calm. Like Ralph, she possessed a rare, intuitive gift with animals. She did not see them as property, she saw them as family. Tony had painstakingly prepared a large, secure enclosure for Zamba's arrival. It was clean, lined with fresh straw, with bowls of fresh water and food waiting. They placed him inside, hoping the quiet environment would finally allow him to rest. But a cage, no matter how comfortable, is not a mother. As the California sun set and the first night enveloped the ranch, the darkness brought back the terror. The silence of the canyon was shattered by Zamba's cries. He paced frantically along the chain-link fence, his small claws digging into the wire. He threw his head back and wailed, a mournful, gut-wrenching sound that echoed through the trees. He was crying out for his mother. He was drowning in an ocean of confusion and grief. He refused to touch his food. He refused the water. He just hurled himself against the enclosure, driven by a desperate primal need for the warmth he had lost. Standing outside the fence, Ralph watched the cub panic. Any traditional animal trainer of that era would have walked away. They would have gone to sleep, telling themselves that the animal just needed to break, that hunger and exhaustion would eventually force the cub into submission. Ralph Helfer could not do that. He looked at Zamba and saw a child in pain. He knew that if this stress continued, it could literally kill the fragile cub. So, Ralph did something that defied every rule of wild animal handling. He turned his back on the cage, walked up to his house, and gathered a thick, heavy blanket and a soft pillow. He walked back down into the cool night air, straight to Zamba's enclosure. Clack! The metal latch of the gate opened. Ralph stepped inside. Zamba froze, retreating into the furthest corner, his eyes wide and glowing in the dim light. Ralph did not reach for him. Instead, he unrolled the blanket right there on the hard ground. He set his pillow down, and then Ralph Helfer, a grown man, lay down on the floor of a lion's cage. "Come here, little one," Ralph whispered, his voice a gentle, steady anchor in the dark. For a long time, nothing happened. The cold night air settled around them. Then, slowly, Zamba took a step forward. His small nose twitched, taking in the scent of the man. The cold floor offered no comfort, but the man radiating heat in the center of the cage did. Hesitantly, inch by inch, the cub crept closer. Finally, defeated by his own exhaustion and an overwhelming need for affection, Zamba climbed onto Ralph's chest. Ralph carefully folded the heavy blanket over the both of them, enveloping the cub in warmth. Zamba pressed his small head directly over Ralph's heart. Thump, 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 the steady, reliable rhythm of life. It wasn't his mother's heartbeat, but it was safe. It was love. Slowly, the frantic shivering stopped. Zamba closed his eyes, let out a long, heavy sigh, and right there, in the dark of a California night, a deep, rumbling purr began to vibrate in his throat. The African orphan had found a home, and a legendary bond was born. Listen to the wind as it rustles through the dry brush, my friends. If you spend enough time out here in the wild, you realize that everything grows according to the soil it is planted in. Plant a seed in harsh, bitter earth, and it will grow thorns. Plant it in rich, nurturing soil, and it will reach for the sun. The same is true for the creatures of this earth. After that first terrifying night in California, Zamba began to grow. He was no longer the shivering, spotted orphan on the African plains. Under the golden California sun, at Africa, USA, he was blossoming into a magnificent adolescent lion, his paws growing as large as dinner plates, a soft, golden fuzz beginning to form the crown of his future mane. He did not grow up alone. To help the young lion socialize and understand the boundaries of play, Ralph introduced him to Duke. Duke was a 5-year-old German shepherd, a massive, sturdy dog with a thick double coat of jet black and deep mahogany. Duke had eyes the color of burnt amber, carrying a calm, unshakable wisdom. Unlike many dogs who would naturally cower at the scent of an apex predator, Duke had been raised by Ralph since he was a pup and had never known the sting of a whip or the shout of a cruel master. His personality was deeply maternal and steady. Nothing rattled him. When Zamba was still small enough to be clumsy, Duke would let the cub gnaw on his ears and tumble over his back. As Zamba grew larger and heavier than the dog, Duke taught him restraint. A gentle but firm growl from the shepherd was all it took for Zamba to understand that he had bitten too hard. Through Duke, Zamba learned his own strength, and more importantly, he learned how to control it. But outside the peaceful sanctuary of Africa, USA, the world was a much darker place for animals. This was the 1960s, a time when the entertainment industry viewed wild animals purely as disposable commodities. The standard practice for taming a beast for the silver screen was rooted in absolute, brutal dominance. One afternoon, the harsh reality of that outside world paid a visit to the ranch. A man named Buck arrived. Buck was a veteran Hollywood animal trainer, a man carved from the unforgiving mold of old-school circuses and studio backlots. In his late 50s, Buck was rail-thin, but made entirely of sinew and gristle. He had a face that looked like a roadmap of bad decisions, deeply lined and perpetually set in a cynical sneer. He smelled constantly of stale tobacco smoke, cheap leather, and the sour sweat of chronic fear. Buck never walked anywhere without a coiled leather bullwhip clipped to his belt, and he carried a heavy, iron-tipped walking stick. His personality was abrasive, built on the core belief that nature was a monster to be broken. Decades of working in an industry that demanded quick results had stripped him of any empathy he might have once had. To Buck, a lion was not a soul. It was a loaded gun waiting to go off. Buck stood leaning against the wooden rail of the enclosure, spitting dark tobacco juice into the dirt, watching Ralph interact with Zamba. What he saw made him shake his head in utter disbelief and dripping condescension. Ralph was not standing tall with a whip. He was rolling around in the red California dust, wrestling with a 150-pound lion. Zamba was pouncing on Ralph, his massive paws wrapping around the man's shoulders, pinning him to the ground. To an outsider, it looked like a lethal attack, but there was no blood. There were no screams. There was only the deep, vibrating hum of Zamba purring and Ralph's breathless laughter echoing across the canyon. "You're a dead man walking, Helfer," Buck sneered, his raspy voice cutting through the peaceful afternoon. "You think that overgrown cat is your friend? You keep hugging him like a house cat, and one day they're going to be mopping you up off the dirt with a sponge." Ralph sat up, dusting the dirt from his jeans, keeping one hand resting casually on Zamba's broad neck. He looked at Buck, his expression calm but resolute. "He's not a monster, Buck. He's a partner. You only get bitten when you give them a reason to hate you." Buck let out a harsh, barking laugh. He pointed his iron-tipped stick at Zamba's massive paws. "Partner? You haven't even pulled his gear, Look at those meat hooks. A real trainer would have had him declawed the minute he came off the boat. And those teeth? You file them down or pull the canines, Ralph? That's how you survive. You take away the weapons, you starve them for a couple of days so they know who controls the meat, and you use the chair and the whip to remind them who the boss is. That's the only language they speak. What Buck was describing was the horrific standard industry practice of the time. To make big cats safe for actors to be around, trainers would surgically amputate the last digit of the animal's toes to remove the claws permanently. A mutilating procedure that left the animals in chronic pain and threw off their natural balance. They would pull their massive canine teeth or file them down to the nerves. They used starvation to force the animals to perform tricks for scraps, and they used the sharp crack of a whip and the confusing legs of a wooden stool to keep the terrified, mutilated creatures at bay. It was a regime of terror. Ralph looked down at Zamba. He looked at the perfect lethal curve of the lion's claws, naturally sheathed inside his heavy paws. He looked at the ivory fangs that flashed when Zamba yawned. He refused. He absolutely and categorically refused to mutilate the creature he had promised to protect. "If I have to break his spirit and tear out his claws to work with him," Ralph said quietly, his voice carrying a steely edge that made even Buck pause, "then I have no business working with him at all. He keeps his claws. He keeps his teeth. He will work with me because he chooses to, not because he is too broken to fight back." Buck scoffed, turning away in disgust. "Suit yourself. I'll send flowers to your funeral." The veteran trainer walked away, taking his archaic, cruel worldview with him. Left alone with his animals, Ralph doubled down on his desire to prove the industry wrong. He called his philosophy affection training. It was a radical, almost heretical concept. The idea that you could control a top-tier predator entirely through respect, love, trust, and reward. Ralph began to teach Zamba the commands he would need for the movie business, but he did it entirely through play. There were no cages or chains used during training. Instead, Ralph used Zamba's natural curiosity and desire for affection. If Ralph wanted to teach Zamba to hit a specific mark, a crucial skill for hitting your spot in front of a camera, he would turn it into a game. He would run to a spot, drop to his knees, and call out joyfully. When Zamba bounded over to join him, Ralph wouldn't just toss him a piece of raw meat. He would throw his arms around the lion's thick neck, burying his face in the growing mane, rubbing the lion's belly, and showering him with praise. The reward wasn't just food. The reward was love. The reward was the physical and emotional connection. To teach the stay command, Ralph would sit Zamba down, holding his hand out flat. He would back away slowly. Because Zamba loved Ralph so deeply, his instinct was to follow the man, just as he had followed Duke the dog. When Zamba broke the stay and trotted after him, Ralph didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He simply turned his back, crossing his arms, withdrawing his attention. For Zamba, the loss of Ralph's joyful engagement was the ultimate punishment. The lion would whine softly, bumping his heavy head against Ralph's legs, asking for the game to continue. Ralph would reset. He would place Zamba back on the spot, hold up his hand, and say, "Stay." This time, when Ralph backed away, Zamba fought his instinct to follow. His golden eyes locked onto Ralph, his muscles twitching, but he remained seated. After a few seconds, Ralph's face broke into a massive smile. "Good boy," he shouted, running back and tackling the lion in a massive dusty hug. Day by day, month by month, the bond solidified into something unbreakable. Zamba possessed the power to crush Ralph's skull with a single bite. He had the claws to tear a man to ribbons. Yet, because he was never struck, never starved, and never mutilated, he never felt the need to defend himself. He understood that the humans around him, led by Ralph and Tony, were his pride. He was a fully intact, incredibly dangerous African lion, yet he possessed the gentle, trusting soul of a creature who only knew kindness. Ralph's desire was no longer just a dream. It was walking beside him, golden and magnificent. The foundation was set. They were ready to show the world, and Hollywood, that love was the greatest tamer of all. Listen to the crackle of the fire for a moment, my friends. Out here in the wild, power is a quiet thing. A mountain doesn't need to shout to prove it is vast, and a river doesn't need to roar to carve through stone. But the world of men is loud, And nowhere is it louder, more chaotic, or more desperate for spectacle than in the beating heart of the entertainment industry, Hollywood. By the time Zamba reached his full maturity, he was no longer the fragile, shivering orphan who had needed to sleep on Ralph Helfer's chest. He had grown into a true king. He was a staggering, magnificent specimen of an African lion, weighing well over 500 pounds. His muscles rolled beneath a flawless golden coat, and his mane was a thick, dark halo of majesty that framed a face of ancient stoic wisdom. He possessed the raw, kinetic power to snap a man's spine with a single swipe of his paw. Yet, beneath that terrifying exterior beat the heart of a gentle giant, molded entirely by Ralph's philosophy of affection training. But while Ralph and Zamba knew the truth of their bond, the cynical, fast-paced world of Hollywood was a completely different beast. Their greatest test came on a sprawling studio backlot in Los Angeles, where Zamba had been booked for a major motion picture. To understand the tension of this moment, you have to understand the environment of a 1960s film set. It was a sensory nightmare, especially for a wild animal. The soundstage was a cavernous, echoing warehouse filled with a labyrinth of thick black cables writhing across the floor like vipers. Dozens of crew members ran frantically in every direction, shouting orders through megaphones. Giant, blinding arc lights hung from the rafters, casting a heat so intense it felt like standing near an open furnace. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, burning dust, sweet makeup, and the sharp tang of gunpowder from special effects rigs. At the center of this hurricane of human anxiety stood the film's director, Arthur Vance. Arthur was a man in his late 40s who looked like he hadn't slept a full night in a decade. He was of average height, with sharp bird-like features, a receding hairline, and a tailored suit that was constantly stained with nervous sweat at the collar. Arthur was a man ruled by deadlines and budgets, and his personality was famously abrasive and mistrustful. 2 years prior, on a different set, Arthur had witnessed a poorly trained, heavily abused tiger turn on its handler, resulting in a gruesome injury that nearly shut down the production. Because of that trauma, Arthur's view of animal actors was permanently scarred. He expected heavy iron cages, thick chains, and men with whips standing by to beat the beast back if it stepped out of line. He expected fear, because fear was the only control he understood. When the massive soundstage doors rolled open for the animal's arrival, the entire crew froze. Arthur clutched his script to his chest, his knuckles turning white. Through the dust and the blinding glare of the studio lights walked Ralph Helfer. And walking right beside him, completely unchained, untethered, and without a single collar around his thick neck, was Zamba. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen right out of the room. A grip dropped a heavy wooden apple box, the loud thud echoing like a gunshot. Several technicians scrambled backward, seeking refuge behind camera dollies and light stands. This was a 500-pound apex predator strolling into a crowded room, like he was taking a walk through a quiet meadow. Arthur Vance's face drained of all color. He marched forward, though he made sure to keep a solid 20 feet between himself and the lion. "Helfer!" Arthur shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Where is his chain? Where is his cage? You can't just walk a live monster onto my set. We have 100 people in here." Ralph stopped, his demeanor as calm as a deep, still pond. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. He simply looked at Arthur, then looked down at Zamba. The lion had stopped when Ralph stopped. Zamba's ears flicked toward the shouting director, but his posture remained entirely relaxed. "He doesn't need a chain, Arthur," Ralph said evenly. "He's a professional, and he's my partner." "He is a wild animal," Arthur shrieked, gesturing wildly. "We have pyrotechnics today. We have loud noises, flashing lights, and a child actor. If that thing gets spooked, he will tear us to pieces." To prove his point, Arthur signaled the special effects coordinator. Without warning, a controlled explosion, part of the scene's background action, detonated on the far side of the set. Boom. A flash of fire and a concussive wave of sound hit the room. Any other lion, trained through fear and dominance, would have panicked. They would have lashed out, seeing the explosion as a threat, their suppressed wild instincts erupting into violence. But Ralph simply knelt beside his massive friend. He placed a steady, calloused hand on Zamba's thick mane and softly said one word. "Stay." Zamba didn't flinch at the explosion. He didn't bare his teeth. Feeling the reassuring touch of Ralph's hand on his mane, the great lion simply let out a heavy sigh, folded his massive front legs beneath him, and lay down on the hard concrete floor. He crossed his giant paws, rested his heavy chin upon them, and closed his eyes under the blinding studio lights. He looked like a giant golden house cat taking a Sunday nap. The entire set went dead silent. The crew stared in absolute disbelief. Arthur's mouth hung open, the script slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. He had never, in all his years in Hollywood, seen a wild predator exhibit such profound, zen-like peace in the middle of chaos. But the true test was yet to come. The climax of the scene required the film's young star to interact directly with the beast. The child actor was a boy named Timmy. Timmy was 6 years old, a tiny, fragile-looking kid with a mop of blonde curls and wide, innocent blue eyes. Because of his youth, Timmy hadn't yet learned to be terrified of the world. He was fearless in the way only a child can be, viewing the giant lion not as a monster, but as a real-life stuffed animal. Standing nervously behind the cameras was Timmy's mother, Eleanor. Eleanor was a woman in her early 30s, dressed in an immaculate, tightly buttoned dress. She was a stage mother, fiercely ambitious and protective. She was visibly trembling, biting her perfectly painted red nails, her eyes darting between her tiny son and the massive predator. She wanted her boy to be a star, but her maternal instincts were screaming at her to run onto the set and snatch him away. "Ralph," Arthur whispered, his voice shaking. "If that lion even twitches toward the boy, I will have the armed guards shoot him, I swear it." "He won't," Ralph replied, stepping back slightly to give Zamba space, demonstrating absolute, unwavering trust in the animal he had raised with love. "Just let the boy approach slowly." Timmy walked onto the brightly lit set. His small leather shoes clicked against the floor. The silence in the cavernous room was so heavy it felt like it could crush bone. Every grip, every lighting technician, every cameraman held their breath. Eleanor clamped a hand over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Timmy stopped right in front of Zamba. The lion's head alone was larger than the child's entire torso. Zamba slowly lifted his massive head, his golden eyes locking onto the boy. "Go ahead, Timmy," Ralph murmured softly from the sidelines. "Just touch his nose." Timmy giggled, a bright chiming sound in the tense room. He reached out with a tiny, fragile hand. Zamba's massive paw was resting near the boy's feet. Instinctively, a cat might unsheathe its claws when a stranger reaches for its face. Zamba's claws were the size of hunting knives. Even a playful swipe could have been fatal. But as the boy's small fingers brushed against the rough, black leather of the lion's nose, Zamba did something extraordinary. He looked at Ralph, seeking his father's approval. Ralph smiled and nodded. Zamba turned back to the boy. With slow, deliberate care, the giant lion visibly tightened his massive paws, ensuring that every single one of his razor-sharp claws remained deeply and safely retracted beneath his fur. He then leaned his massive head forward, pressing his cold, wet nose gently into the palm of the child's hand. A deep, rumbling vibration began to emanate from the lion's chest. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Zamba was purring. Timmy laughed, using both hands to awkwardly pat the lion's thick mane. Zamba simply closed his eyes, accepting the clumsy affection of the child with the infinite patience of a loving guardian. He knew his own strength, and he chose to use it for gentleness. For 10 agonizing, beautiful seconds, the scene played out. Then Arthur Vance, wiping a tear of sheer relief and awe from his cheek, softly called out, "Cut! Print it!" The set exhaled. The tension shattered, replaced by a wave of spontaneous, thunderous applause from the crew. Eleanor ran onto the set, sweeping Timmy into her arms, weeping as she thanked Ralph. Arthur approached, shaking his head, looking at Ralph and Zamba as if they had just performed a miracle, and in a way they had. In that single moment, amidst the bright lights and the chaos of Hollywood, Ralph Helfer and Zamba proved that the old ways of violence and fear were obsolete. Love had walked onto a movie set, in the form of a 500-pound African lion, and the world of entertainment would never be the same again. Listen to the rain, my friends. Out here, we often pray for rain. We look up at the sky and beg for it to wash the dust from the leaves and fill the dry creek beds. But nature is not a faucet that we can turn on and off at our convenience. Nature is a living, breathing force, and sometimes, when she speaks, she does not whisper, she roars. The conflict that would truly test the bond between Ralph Helfer and his magnificent lion, Zamba, did not happen under the bright, artificial lights of a Hollywood soundstage. It happened under a sky that had turned the color of bruised iron, during one of the most devastating natural disasters in the history of Southern California. It was January of 1969. For days, the rain had been falling over the Soledad Canyon, where the Africa USA ranch was nestled. At first, it was a welcome shower, but soon it turned into a relentless, driving deluge. The earth, usually so thirsty, drank until it could hold no more. The ground became slick and saturated, and the small, babbling creek that ran through the heart of the sanctuary began to swell. It turned from a clear stream into a churning, angry ribbon of thick brown mud, tearing at the roots of ancient oak trees and dragging heavy boulders down the mountainside. Working tirelessly alongside Ralph and Tony was a ranch hand named Frank. Frank was a sturdy, barrel-chested man in his late 40s, with a thick salt and pepper beard that was currently plastered to his face by the freezing rain. He wore a heavy yellow slicker that stood out like a beacon in the gloom. Normally, Frank was a stoic, quiet man who communicated more in grunts than words. He had a deep respect for the animals, but his personality was shaped by a profound, underlying caution. Years ago, before coming to California, Frank had lost his family's farm in the Midwest to a devastating tornado. That trauma had left him hyper-aware of nature's destructive capability. He knew firsthand that when the earth decided to take something back, no man could stand in its way. Now, staring at the rising water, that old, wide-eyed panic was beginning to show in his weathered face. Frank was desperately trying to calm Cleo, a 10-year-old female African elephant. Cleo weighed several tons and possessed a deeply wrinkled slate-gray hide and large, expressive eyes framed by incredibly long lashes. Usually, Cleo was the gentle matriarch of the lower compound, known for playfully spraying the ranch hands with water from her trunk on hot summer days. But today, the rising floodwaters had stripped away her playful nature. The icy mud was swirling around her thick legs, and she was trumpeting in sheer primal terror, pulling frantically against her heavy lead rope. Frank was shouting, trying to guide her toward the hillside, his voice completely swallowed by the deafening roar of the storm. Suddenly, with a sound like a freight train crashing through a brick wall, a massive wall of water breached the upper canyon. A dam further up the mountain had given way. The creek didn't just overflow, it exploded. Within minutes, the entire valley floor of Africa USA was submerged in a raging, icy torrent. The water rose with terrifying speed, waist-deep, then chest-deep. It was a scene of absolute apocalyptic chaos. Hundreds of animals, from Bengal tigers to chimpanzees, from bears to exotic birds, were suddenly fighting for their lives against a current that was strong enough to flip trucks. Cages and enclosures that had been built to withstand the strength of wild beasts were being torn apart like matchsticks by the sheer force of the water, and the massive uprooted trees acting as battering rams. Ralph and his team abandoned any thought of their own safety. They plunged into the freezing, debris-filled water, fighting against the treacherous current to unlock cages and cut locks, giving the animals a chance to swim to the high ground of the surrounding hills. Ralph's hands were bleeding, numb from the biting cold, his lungs burning as he swallowed mouthfuls of muddy water. He was dodging spinning logs and submerged fencing, driven by an adrenaline fueled by pure love for his animals. But as Ralph pushed a panicked leopard toward the safety of the ridge, his heart stopped. He looked toward the lower section of the compound, where the water was deepest and the current was most violent. Zamba's enclosure was entirely cut off. The water had already risen over the chain-link fencing. The giant 500-pound lion was stranded on the roof of his wooden den box, which was groaning and shifting dangerously under the relentless battering of the flood. Zamba was pacing on the small, shrinking island of wood, his golden coat soaked and plastered to his massive frame, his roars of distress piercing through the sound of the raging river. Ralph didn't hesitate. He dove back into the churning brown water. The current immediately grabbed him, trying to drag him down into the darkness. He fought with every ounce of his strength, kicking against the submerged hazards, using the tops of sunken fences to pull himself forward. The water was agonizingly cold, stealing the heat from his core, making his muscles cramp and seize. But he kept his eyes locked on the golden figure of the lion. When Ralph finally reached the enclosure, he hauled himself up onto the shifting roof of the den box, gasping for air, his body trembling violently. Now, my friends, you must understand the gravity of this exact moment. A 500-pound apex predator, when pushed to the absolute limit of survival, is the most dangerous creature on the face of the earth. When a wild animal is terrified, freezing, and facing imminent death, its brain reverts purely to the reptilian instinct of self-preservation. It will thrash, it will bite, it will kill anything that comes near it in a desperate, blind panic. Even the most seasoned animal handlers would have expected Zamba to strike out, to perceive the approaching human as a threat or a ladder, and to inadvertently drown the man in his panic to escape. But Zamba did not strike out. As Ralph pulled his freezing, exhausted body onto the wet wood, the giant lion let out a low, desperate whine. Zamba didn't see a threat. He saw his father. He saw his protector. The water surged higher, washing over the roof of the den box. They were going to be swept away. Ralph wrapped his freezing, bleeding arms around Zamba's massive, muscular neck. And Zamba, demonstrating a level of trust that defied every known law of nature, leaned his enormous weight into Ralph. He pressed his massive head against Ralph's chest, just as he had done on that very first night when he was a shivering, orphaned cub. The icy water roared around them, threatening to tear them apart. But in the center of that devastating maelstrom, there was a pocket of absolute, unbreakable faith. Ralph buried his face in Zamba's soaked mane, sharing his body heat with the freezing animal, and the lion shared his in return. "I've got you, Zamba!" Ralph shouted over the roaring flood, holding onto the lion with a grip fueled by desperation and love. "I'm right here. We go together." And they did. When the wooden box finally gave way, splintering beneath them, they plunged into the icy rapids. Zamba could have easily outswum Ralph, leaving the struggling human behind. He could have panicked and dragged Ralph under. Instead, the giant lion swam parallel to Ralph, matching his pace, allowing the exhausted man to keep one arm firmly draped over his broad, muscular back. Zamba became Ralph's anchor in the chaotic waters, and Ralph remained Zamba's guiding compass. Together, fighting the debris, the freezing cold, and the relentless pull of the current, man and lion slowly battled their way across the submerged valley. They moved as one single entity, bound by an invisible tether that was infinitely stronger than any iron chain. When they finally dragged themselves out of the mud and onto the safety of the hillside, they collapsed together in the pouring rain. The Africa USA ranch, the dream Ralph had spent his life building, was gone, swallowed entirely by the muddy, roaring waters. But as Ralph lay there, shivering uncontrollably, feeling the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the giant lion resting his head across his legs, he knew that the most important thing had survived. The flood had washed away their home, but it had permanently cemented a truth that no one could ever deny: the absolute, triumphant power of unconditional love. Look at the scars on an old oak tree, my friends. Out here in the wild, we know that surviving a storm changes a living thing. The bark grows back thicker, the roots dig deeper into the earth, and the tree stands with a new, quiet kind of strength. When the devastating floodwaters of 1969 finally receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud and shattered wood, the sanctuary of Africa USA was physically destroyed. But from that destruction, something infinitely stronger took root. The bond between Ralph Helfer and Zamba had been forged in the crucible of absolute disaster. They were no longer simply a trainer and an animal actor. They were fellow survivors. They were brothers who had looked death in the eye and chosen to hold on to each other. The story of their survival did not stay confined to the muddy canyons of California. It spread like wildfire through the tight-knit circles of the entertainment industry. For decades, the old guard of Hollywood had justified their cruel methods, the whips, the chains, the starvation, by claiming that wild animals were soulless, opportunistic killers. They preached that the second a predator had the upper hand, it would turn on its master. But Zamba had possessed the ultimate upper hand. Stranded in the freezing rapids, terrified and fighting for his life, the 500-pound lion had not attacked. He had offered his back to a drowning man. That undeniable fact shattered the industry's archaic illusions. Because of this profound revelation, the culture in Hollywood began to shift. The studios started demanding humane treatment on their sets, and to learn how to achieve it, a new generation of trainers began flocking to the newly rebuilt Africa USA to study under Ralph. One of these new disciples was a young man named Leo Rossi. Leo was 28 years old, built like a lightweight boxer, lean, restless, and tightly coiled. He had thick, slicked-back dark hair, a sharp, angular jawline, and a constant nervous habit of tapping his fingers against his thigh when he stood still. Leo had spent his early 20s apprenticing under men like Buck, learning the trade through intimidation and force. His personality used to be brash and overconfident, a defensive shield built to hide his underlying fear of the animals he worked with. But the flood and the legendary stories of Zamba's loyalty had shaken Leo to his core. He realized his entire career had been built on a lie. He came to Ralph's sanctuary seeking redemption, desperately wanting to learn the philosophy of affection training. When Leo first arrived at the sanctuary, he expected to find a rigid training regimen. Instead, he found a profound, almost spiritual peace. Years had passed since the Great Flood, and time, my friends, is the one predator that no living creature can outrun. Zamba was no longer the spry, endlessly energetic lion of his youth. He was moving deep into his teenage years, an incredibly advanced age for an African lion who rarely saw past their 12th winter in the harshness of the wild. Zamba's magnificent golden coat had lost some of its vibrant luster, and his massive thick mane was now heavily threaded with distinguished streaks of silver and white. The muscles that once propelled him through the air with explosive grace were beginning to ache. His steps were slower, heavier, and more deliberate, hampered by the stiff joints of old age. But what Zamba lost in physical agility, he gained in a breathtaking, soulful presence. Leo Rossi stood near the edge of the large, grassy enclosure, watching Ralph and Zamba. It was late afternoon, the golden hour when the California sun cast long, soft shadows across the earth. Ralph, whose own hair was beginning to show the silver touch of time, was sitting in the cool dirt beneath the sprawling branches of a massive pepper tree. He wasn't holding a clicker, a treat pouch, or a script. He was simply sitting cross-legged, his back resting against the wide trunk of the tree. Zamba lumbered over to him. The giant lion didn't pounce or wrestle the way he used to. He approached slowly, lowering his massive frame to the ground with a heavy, contented sigh that kicked up a small cloud of red dust. Zamba stretched his huge front paws out and gently laid his enormous, heavy head directly into Ralph's lap. Watching from the fence line, Leo held his breath. He had been taught that you never let a predator have access to your vital organs, that you never let your guard down, and that you never, ever show vulnerability. Yet here was a man, completely relaxed, bearing the weight of a lion's skull on his thighs, gently running his calloused fingers through the silver-streaked mane. What Leo was witnessing was the purest culmination of affection training. It had evolved far beyond a method to get a lion to hit a mark on a movie set. It had become a state of profound empathy. There were no spoken commands between Ralph and Zamba anymore. They didn't need words. Their communication had distilled into a silent, deeply intimate language that only the two of them fully understood. When Ralph felt a knot of tension in his own shoulders from the stress of running the sanctuary, Zamba would sense the shift in the man's breathing. The lion would shift his weight, look up into Ralph's face, and offer a slow, deliberate blink of his amber eyes. In the language of the big cats, a slow blink is the ultimate sign of trust and peace. Ralph would blink back, his heart rate slowing to match the steady, rhythmic breathing of the beast in his lap. When Zamba's hips ached from the damp morning air, he didn't roar or lash out in pain. He would simply press his cold nose against Ralph's palm and let out a soft, low rumble deep in his throat, a sound barely audible to anyone standing more than a few feet away. It wasn't a growl of anger, it was a murmur of discomfort. Ralph would understand instantly, reaching down with strong, knowing hands to massage the stiff muscles along the lion's spine until the pain subsided and the murmur shifted into a resonant, heavy purr. They shared their joys and their sorrows in the quiet shade of that pepper tree. Ralph would sit for hours, talking softly about his day, his worries, and his dreams, while Zamba simply listened, occasionally flicking a rounded ear or letting out a soft chuff of acknowledgement. The lion absorbed the man's emotions, and the man absorbed the lion's ancient grounding peace. Leo Rossi wiped a stray tear from his cheek as he watched them. In that silent tableau beneath the tree, Leo saw the absolute truth. Master and servant did not exist here. Trainer and beast were obsolete terms. Ralph and Zamba were two halves of a single soul, separated only by species, but united by an empathy so deep it defied human comprehension. Hollywood was changing because Ralph Helfer had proven that when you strip away the fear, the whips, and the desire to conquer, what remains is a love powerful enough to tame the wildest heart on earth. Listen to the silence that follows the sunset, my friends. Out here in the wild, the end of the day brings a profound stillness, a quiet exhalation from the earth itself. Time is the one river we cannot swim against, no matter how strong we are. In the natural world, the end of a life is rarely a gentle thing. It is usually dictated by the harsh, unforgiving laws of survival, starvation, or the teeth of a younger rival. But every so often, love manages to carve out a quiet space where nature's brutal rules do not apply. For Ralph Helfer and Zamba, that quiet space lasted for an astonishing, miraculous 18 years. 18 years. To understand the gravity of that number, you must know that in the unforgiving brush of the African savannah, a male lion is incredibly fortunate to see his 12th winter. The wild grinds them down. But Zamba was not ground down by the world. He was uplifted by it. He had lived a life of absolute safety, endless affection, and profound purpose. Yet, even the greatest kings must eventually lay down their crowns. It was a cool, quiet evening in California when the inevitable finally arrived. The golden hour had passed, leaving the sky painted in bruised shades of twilight. Inside Zamba's spacious, hay-lined enclosure, the air was still and heavy with an unspoken understanding. Kneeling in the fresh golden straw beside the massive lion was Dr. Robert Evans. Bob, as everyone at the sanctuary called him, was a man in his late 50s. He had a balding head, a neatly trimmed white beard, and kind, sorrowful eyes magnified by thick, wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a faded flannel shirt and possessed the quiet, deliberate movements of a man who had spent his life trying to heal the unhealable. Before coming to Africa, USA, a decade earlier, Bob had worked as a veterinarian for a series of traveling circuses. He had spent his early career witnessing the darkest, most cruel aspects of human dominance over animals. He had seen tigers with shattered spirits and bears with scarred muzzles, and it had turned him into a deeply cynical, heartbroken man. But meeting Ralph and witnessing the sheer, unadulterated trust radiating from Zamba had restored Bob's faith in humanity. Now, Bob pressed the cold metal of his stethoscope against Zamba's massive, graying ribcage, listening intently. Ralph sat on the other side of the lion, his hand resting gently on Zamba's flank. Ralph was older now, the lines on his face etched deeply by years of hard work, joy, and the heavy responsibility of caring for hundreds of lives. His sandy hair had turned a distinguished silver, mirroring the thick, frosty white streaks that now dominated Zamba's once golden mane. Dr. Bob pulled the stethoscope from his ears and let it drop around his neck. He looked across the great expanse of the lion's back to meet Ralph's eyes. Bob's voice was barely a whisper, cracking slightly with emotion. "His heart is just tired, Ralph. There is no disease. There is no pain. His organs are simply winding down. It is just his time. He's lived longer and better than any lion in history." Ralph swallowed hard, his throat tight, and simply nodded. He didn't ask Bob to try any desperate medical interventions. He loved Zamba far too much to force him to linger in a failing body. He reached out and grasped the veterinarian's shoulder in a silent gesture of gratitude. Understanding that this was a sacred space, Bob quietly gathered his medical bag, offered Zamba one last, gentle stroke on the shoulder, and slipped out of the enclosure, leaving the two lifelong friends alone in the gathering dark. The sanctuary around them grew completely silent. It was as if the other animals, the elephants, the chimpanzees, the tigers, sensed that a great presence was preparing to depart, and they offered their silence in reverence. Ralph shifted his weight and moved closer, sitting cross-legged in the straw. 18 years ago, on Zamba's very first night in America, Ralph had brought a blanket into a cold cage and laid down next to a terrified, shivering, orphaned cub. He had used the rhythm of his own heartbeat to soothe the little creature to sleep. Now, the circle was closing. Zamba's breathing was shallow and labored, His massive body, which had once leaped playfully over fences and swam through raging floodwaters to save the man sitting beside him, was now incredibly frail. The thick muscles had deteriorated, leaving the heavy architecture of his bones visible beneath his dulling coat. But his spirit, the gentle, ancient, empathetic soul that had captivated Hollywood and changed an entire industry, remained completely intact. With a slow, monumental effort, Zamba lifted his heavy, magnificent head from the straw. He shifted his weight just enough to slide his massive chin onto Ralph's lap. Ralph leaned over, burying his face in the coarse, silver-streaked mane. The smell of the lion, dust, dry grass, and that deeply familiar wild musk filled his senses, bringing a flood of memories crashing down upon him. He remembered the blinding lights of the movie sets, the terror of the Great Flood, the countless quiet afternoons resting beneath the pepper tree, and the steady, unbreakable presence of the greatest friend he had ever known. Tears, hot and fast, began to fall from Ralph's eyes, soaking into the lion's thick fur. "It's okay, my beautiful boy," Ralph whispered, his voice trembling, but his hands remaining steady as he stroked the broad, flat bridge of Zamba's nose. "You can let go. You've done everything. You've been so good. I am right here. I will always be right here." Hearing the familiar, soothing cadence of Ralph's voice, Zamba opened his eyes one last time. The great amber orbs were clouded slightly by age, but as they focused on Ralph's face, they shone with a profound, unmistakable clarity. In that final look, there was no fear of the unknown, no animalistic panic as the end approached. There was only absolute peace. It was the same familiar, affectionate gaze that had anchored Ralph through every storm of his adult life. Zamba looked at Ralph, acknowledging the man who had been his father, his brother, and his partner. Deep within the lion's chest, a sound began to form. It was weak, barely a vibration, but Ralph felt it thrumming against his legs. It was a purr, a final, gentle hum of contentment. Zamba offered one slow, incredibly heavy blink. He let out a long, quiet sigh that ruffled the straw, and then he simply closed his eyes and went to sleep. The great chest stopped rising. The purr faded into the silence of the canyon. The king had departed. The void left in Ralph's heart that night was massive, an aching chasm that felt impossible to fill. Walking out of that enclosure alone was the hardest thing Ralph Helfer ever had to do. The physical presence of the 500-pound giant was gone, and the sanctuary felt impossibly empty without his deep, resonant roars greeting the dawn. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into years, the acute pain of grief slowly transformed into an overwhelming, radiant sense of gratitude. Ralph realized that Zamba had not truly left him. The lion had left behind a legacy that was actively changing the world. Zamba's life was the ultimate, irrefutable proof of the affection training philosophy. He was not just a successful animal actor. He was a living, breathing testament to the power of compassion. The most dangerous, lethal beast on the planet, a creature biologically engineered to hunt, kill, and dominate, had shown humanity a different path. Zamba had proven that when we choose to set aside our whips, our chains, and our desire to conquer, and instead sow seeds of gentleness, respect, and deep compassion, we do not reap danger. We reap absolute, unwavering loyalty. Zamba was a messenger. He came from the blood-soaked plains of Africa to the glittering, chaotic world of Hollywood to deliver a single, profound truth. That love is the universal language. It does not care about the boundaries of species. It does not care about the sharp edge of teeth or the curve of a claw, and it does not fade when the body grows old. The love between a man and a lion changed an industry, and it proved that the wildest hearts are often the most capable of incredible tenderness. And out here, my friends, when the wind blows through the Soledad Canyon, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear it. Not a roar of anger, but the deep, resonant, eternal purr of a king who knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was loved. Think about your own daily life. We all face our own wild beasts. Sometimes it is a difficult relationship, a stubborn conflict, a stranger who is unkind, or even the heavy burdens we carry inside our own minds. When we are met with harshness, our instinct is to bare our own teeth and fight back. But what if we chose a different way? What if we approach the difficult people and situations in our lives with patience, respect, and unconditional love? When you respond to anger with a calm heart, you have the power to disarm the heaviest defenses. You can tame the storms and the people around you just by offering them a safe place to land. Love truly is the greatest tamer of all.
If this journey touched your heart today, please share this story with someone who might need a reminder of how powerful kindness can be. Leave a comment below to let me know your thoughts, and please subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these beautiful moments around the fire together. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He grant you the courage to love fiercely and the patience to be gentle in a world that so desperately needs it. If you believe in the healing, unbreakable power of love and compassion, please type Amen in the comments below. Until next time, keep your heart open and take care of each other.